if athletes know their body, we ask questions around, do you ever see white salt marks on your skin? Do you get many muscle cramps? Do you feel your sweat rates low, moderate, high, or very high? And in that picture, we can make a rough and ready estimate, which is not as good as having an actual sweat test, but it's a vast amount better than just shooting in the dark, which is what people do most of the time.
That Triathlon Show, episode 49. Hello, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and I'm a bit under the weather today with a bit of a cold, as is typical for a Finnish July, which is when I record this intro. But it's all good because the interview that we have is long, so I'll keep it short and sweet with this intro. My guest today is Andy Blow, who is the founder of Precision Hydration, a company that creates electrolyte solutions that triathletes can use and endurance athletes can use to get their electrolytes that they need based on their individual requirements. And Andy is a former elite triathlete himself, and essentially he scratched his own itch after suffering a lot from cramping and just lack of sodium, as it turns out, especially in long course racing. So we'll talk about things like why sodium is such a critical component of your hydration strategy and the massive variance in sodium requirements between individuals that results in there being no easy one-size-fits-all solution. However, Precision Hydration has a free online sweat test that you can take to determine with good accuracy what your own individual sodium needs are. And we, of course, the bulk of the interview is actually how to take that knowledge into practice and apply this in your hydration, in training and racing, and in your hydration loading, if I can call it that, before races, and all sorts of other things. So I hope you enjoy this interview. Let's jump in and meet Andy Blow. All right, so today's interview on That Triathlon Show is, or the interviewee, I should say, is Andy Blow from Precision Hydration. Hi, Andy. Welcome to the show.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on.
And yeah, it's great to have you. And you are recording from mobile phone in on the road towards London, a cycling event in London. Was that Ride London? Was that what
yes.
It's called?
Yeah, we're heading to Ride London this weekend. There's a big cycling expo before the event, and great chance to meet a lot of customers, a lot of athletes that we're supporting. So yeah, really looking forward to it, actually. Although the weather's not hydration weather at the moment, really, it's kind of wet and raining. Yeah. Hopefully it will improve before the ride goes off on Sunday.
Hopefully so, but as we'll get into in this interview, there's still a reason to hydrate and be quite particular with what you have in your bottle as well. But before going into that, just give us a really brief background of yourself and how you came to found Precision Hydration.
Sure. So I started out. I've got two routes of interest into it, really. I did study sport and exercise science with a kind of a leaning towards exercise physiology when I was younger, and I got a BSc in sports science from the University of Bath in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So I had an interest in all things to do with performance and human physiology then. But I was also a triathlete, and I raced at an elite and sort of semi-professional level for a few years. And one of the big things that I learned when I was racing, I made a lot of mistakes with hydration, especially in hot weather and in the heat, and had lots of issues as a result. And all of that combined, plus working with some athletes, particularly athletes in motorsport, actually, who had hydration related issues, eventually led me to put everything that we do now together into a business, which is Precision Hydration.
Yeah. So what were those problems that you had in your races? Can you go a bit into more detail on that?
Yeah. I when I was racing short distance races, and especially in cool conditions, I rarely had problems, and I kind of felt like I could race to the limits of my fitness and my technique and general ability. So there was nothing specific holding me back other than how fit I was and how well prepared I was. When I then jumped up to race longer distances, and especially when I went to hot races in either America or Hawaii or Thailand or places like that, I found that something else seemed to be limiting my performance, because I would often break down in races. I would get lots of cramps. I would feel very, very ill, very nauseous, and just generally unwell, and have a really horrible time, and quite often end up in the medical tent. So it took me a long time to figure out what it was, and it was a combination of over drinking too much water and too many sports drinks with not very much electrolyte in them, and also the fact that I sweat a lot. I have a very high sweat rate, and as it later turned out, I found out I have a very high concentration of electrolytes, or sodium specifically, in my sweat.
Yeah, so when you found it out, or probably partially by coincidence, and started increasing that sodium intake, did you find that your performances then started to improve again, and you didn't have those cramps and issues?
Very much so. It was, I would describe, and I have described to other people, the difference for me was like the difference between night and day. It was so dramatic. When I started to be more aggressive with my sodium intake in long distance races, then I could keep going at full power. I felt a bit like I used to when I was racing short course, in that the limitation on my performance was how fit and fast I was, not some kind of nutritional or other issue. So it was a real game changer for me.
Yeah. So why is sodium so important in endurance performances?
Well, the thing about sodium is that it's the main electrolyte that's implicated in your blood volume and your fluid balance, and also muscle contraction and cellular communication. So when you sweat, you obviously lose water and fluid onto the surface of the skin, and that fluid comes from your blood plasma, and your blood plasma is very salty. So if you just sweated out, blood plasma, it would be very salty indeed. And that's in fact what sort of happens with people who have cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disease. Their sweat glands can't reabsorb electrolytes either very well, or in fact in some cases basically at all. So they lose loads and loads of salt. People without CF, the rest of us, the kind of non-CF population, we reabsorb some of the sodium and electrolytes when we sweat at the sweat gland before the sweat leaves the skin, and that helps conserve it in the body. But we all do that to a varying degree, and so that the amount of sodium that you lose has knock-on effects to how well you maintain your hydration status, how well your muscles can contract, and so on and so forth. So it's that sodium is kind of definitely the key electrolyte in sweat, and it's the one that's lost in the largest and most variable amounts.
So can we pretty much ignore the others? Because I know, and you know, that there are things thrown out at times about cramping being caused by magnesium. Maybe that's out of fashion these days, but magnesium and other electrolytes have also been at some points implicated in endurance performance. But is it pretty much proven now that sodium is the one electrolyte that we just need to focus on?
I think in a sense, yes. And that sense is that if you're talking about electrolytes that are predominantly lost through sweat, so if you're saying that what could be caused by sweating, like what problems could be caused by sweating, like in terms of electrolyte balance, you lose mainly sodium in your sweat. It's around the 90% of all the electrolytes you lose in your sweat are sodium. The rest are a mixture of potassium, calcium, magnesium, and so on. And the thing is, if you're deficient or you have imbalances in any of those electrolytes, I think it's plausible there could be problems with cramping. So we certainly come across people who've said that they've had cramping issues and then taken magnesium supplements, and that's helped them. But it's more likely, I think, that if you're getting problems related to electrolytes other than sodium, it's more because you may have a dietary deficiency, or you may have low levels of those in your body anyway. You may be not absorbing them very well if you are eating them. So when you're talking about, sweat loss and electrolyte related issues, almost exclusively it's going to come down to sodium loss.
Yeah, okay. And just piggybacking on that question on why sodium is important, just to make it very clear, you mentioned hyponatremia and muscle contraction. Are those the two things that you risk having if you lose too much sodium, or are there any other things? And to what extent do these things occur?
Yeah, so hyponatremia is a very interesting and a complicated one, and it's one that gets debated a lot because a lot of hyponatremia is caused more by people drinking too much and diluting their sodium levels in their blood rather than by them losing a lot of sodium. The people that lose a lot of salt in their sweat are, and I'm in that group, and we've tested a lot of athletes over the years who fall into that group. There's a kind of tipping point at which sodium loss also comes into the equation as well. No one knows really yet exactly where that tipping point is, but essentially if you're losing sodium and fluid at a very high rate and only putting low sodium or fluids or water back in, you reach a tipping point for diluting your body a lot sooner than someone who's sweating out more dilute sweat. So both of those things sort of apply, if that makes sense. With regards to other issues that low sodium levels cause, the main one really is contraction of your blood volume, because when you're exercising, the amount of sodium in your blood, your body's trying to balance it, and if you lose a lot of sodium, one way that your body can balance the the concentration of it in the blood is to allow you to lose fluid and your whole blood volume contracts. So your blood volume stays at the right saltiness, but the whole volume of it drops, and that makes it harder to pump around the body. It gives you less of a reservoir to then sweat out further and compromises your cardiovascular performance, which is obviously preferable to keeling over and dying, which is what happens if hyponatremia gets very severe, but it's not compatible with doing your best performance in an Ironman or something. So it's always a bit of a fine balance on keeping your blood volume up, keeping your muscles contracting, obviously not getting hyponatremia, but at the same time not just overdoing fluid and salt.
Great. Okay, that's a perfect summary. And so how then do you know how much sodium you need to take? I guess it's not a one-size-fits-all problem, is it?
Definitely not. And that's the angle we're coming at it from, really, with precision hydration, because I found that for me, I followed the standard guidance at the time in the late 90s, early 2000s of what you should be taking in terms of electrolytes and fluids. And a lot of it was about drinking fluids mainly and a little bit of electrolyte, which can work for people who have very low sodium output in their sweat. The difference we see in the amount of salt that people lose in their sweat is gigantic. So some people can lose 200 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat, and some people can lose over 2,000. So there's kind of a tenfold difference. And then you multiply up the differences you see between individual people's sweat rates, and we see up to a 5 or 6-fold variance in individual sweat rates. The actual difference in net sodium loss and net fluid loss between two people in the same conditions can be massive. And really, how you work out what you need is as much an art as it is a science, because it's the whole picture of how your body manages sodium and fluid balance is very complicated. There's a lot of variables involved, but I think when you're doing endurance sport, the main ones are how well hydrated and how well topped up with electrolytes are you when you start the event. You've kind of got your reservoir then, and then at what rate are you losing them, and that's how much you're sweating in terms of fluid volume, how much sodium you're losing in that sweat, and then how much you can physically get back in to compensate for those losses. And you don't have to put in as much as you're losing, because the body can tolerate a drop in fluid, a drop in electrolyte levels to a degree and still perform very well. But it inevitably ends up in a bit of scientific investigation at first to find out what your numbers are like in terms of fluid loss, electrolyte loss, and then some trial and error in the field to say, right, well, if I replace X amount per hour or per unit volume of fluid that I drink, how does my body respond to that? So that may be a very long-winded way of trying to answer that question, but it's kind of knowing the inputs and outputs, and then having to play around with those numbers and figuring out what you can get in to replace what you're losing.
Yeah, and to put it in short, then you need to know your numbers. That's the sweat rate and the sweat sodium content. And the sweat rate, we actually talked about this on a recent episode with Jesse Kropelnicki. Well, he suggests maybe just trying in races to see how many bottles you need to drink so that you pee on the bike. But another way that we also talked about is just going out for an hour or 2 hours and just calculating how much fluid you take in, and then you weigh yourself before and after and see the difference. So that's pretty straightforward. You can calculate the volume of fluid that you lose per hour that way. But what about the sweat sodium content? How can you find that out?
So yeah, that's a lot of what we've focused on. So we definitely advise athletes, and we work with athletes to measure their sweat rate. And you measure your sweat rate in a few different conditions, environmental conditions, a few different exercise intensities and modes of exercise, biking, running. You build up a picture quite quickly of what your sweat rate's like. Then your sweat sodium concentration, one of the good things about it is that it's relatively stable and fixed for you. Although it varies a lot between people, all of the testing and analysis that we've done with athletes and some of the literature out there supports the idea that it's not a number that fluctuates dramatically. So, to give you an example, I lose around about 1,800 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat, which is on the very high side. And whenever I've been tested, in different months, different training phases, and over a period of many years, that number's not deviated by more than about 5 or 8%. So that's kind of a fixed figure. And the way we test sweat sodium is we use a piece of diagnostic equipment that is used in the medical field to help diagnose cystic fibrosis, and it stimulates the sweat glands on the arm. We take a small sweat sample and then we run it through an analyzer to look at the electrolyte composition, and that gives us a really good ballpark number on what your sodium loss is going to be like.
Yeah, and then I was stalking your website, of course, to prepare, and you have a sweat test there as well that can give you a more rougher ballpark, but still an estimate. And do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really good place for people to start with this process, because actually a lot of athletes who train a lot and compete a lot know their bodies quite well, and we've put together a series of 8 or 10 questions and as part of a questionnaire that's available online at our website, precisionhydration.com, and you answer them and it gives you a report which suggests whether you're likely to be a low, a medium, a high, or a very high fluid and sodium loss athlete, and then gives you some strategies to try off the back of it to see how you get on. And what we've done, we've been doing that for 4 or 5 years now. We have a lot of data from athletes who've done it, and we've compared it with a lot of athletes who've done proper sweat tests as well. We find that actually, if athletes know their body, we ask questions around, do you ever see white salt marks on your skin? Do you get many muscle cramps? Do you feel your sweat rates low, moderate, high, or very high? And in that picture we can make a rough and ready estimate, which is not as good as having an actual sweat test, but it's a vast amount better than just shooting in the dark, which is what people do most of the time. Yeah,
here's a kind of a tangent, but maybe something that you might be interested in doing if you're not doing it already. When you have athletes come in and do the testing with the cystic fibrosis related equipment that you have, do you ask them the same questions? Because that way you could build up the algorithm to kind of exactly match or become very accurate with those questions, or do you use intuition to form those questions yourselves?
No, we have exactly the same question set. So the questions that you get asked when you do our online test are the same as you get asked when you do our advanced sweat test. And you're right, the algorithm, we've used all those thousands of data points to help refine it, because ultimately what that algorithm is trying to do is estimate your net sodium loss, which is in effect a factor of your total sweat volume output multiplied by the sweat concentration. And with the sweat test, we get the sweat concentration. Without it, we can almost take a guess at it by the way you answer some of the questions. But then your total sweat volume output is mainly going to be driven by your sweat rate, the amount of hours of activity you're doing, and the environmental conditions that it's in. So and actually our algorithm, is always being tweaked ever so slightly, because we review the data quite often, and I think it's got better over the years. It's still not perfect, and I don't know that it ever will be, but it's the great thing about it is it takes 90 seconds to do. It's absolutely free, and it sort of gives you a starting point for your own little bit of personal trial and error, which is ultimately, I think, what a lot of, that's what most committed endurance athletes are willing to do, is go out, take this kind of information, and then go and trial it in the field and see how they get on.
Yeah, and I can confirm this. I just took it myself today, as I said, and it seems to give me very solid advice, and it makes sense to me intuitively that what the advice that it gives me and the guidelines are what would make sense for me in terms of sodium intake and hydration. So now that, let's say that the listeners go out and do this, so they know how much they need to get in. What are the best ways to get sodium in during exercise or racing?
Yeah, good question. I used to, when I raced, there weren't many options, or there weren't so many options, and I used to just use either just typical salt tablets, or the kind of sodium capsules which you see on the market as well now. The electrolyte drinks that were available 10, 15 years ago, most of them were pretty low strength, around 400 or 500 milligrams of sodium per litre, and that's actually still the case now a lot of the time. Most commercial sports drinks are very low actually in their sodium composition, because I think there's a funny attitude towards sodium, because sodium is a kind of a bad guy in nutrition. It's seen as being a bad guy because a lot of people do overeat it in the day-to-day diet, and if you're not requiring it and sweating it out, it could be quite bad for your health. So sometimes I think some of these products keep sodium low because they're selling to athletes who are wanting, in inverted commas, a healthy product. So I used to just take sodium capsules or salt tablets, and I would basically work out how many milligrams I thought I needed. In my case, in an Ironman, it was usually between about 1 and 1.5 grams, or 1,500 milligrams per hour, and just take multiples of those tablets and wash them down with water. I found that to be effective. You can, though, you can get the sodium from wherever you like, because table salt, which is sodium chloride, is in lots of foods. So eating salty foods, if you've got a handle on roughly how much salt's in them and you have a target number in mind, you can eat salty foods, and that's a great way of getting sodium in before and after training and events, for definite. I'm not so much of a big fan of eating salty stuff on the move because it's often bulky and difficult to carry.
Can I interject here, and can you also give the listeners a clarification on the difference between salt and sodium, and what you need to keep in mind if you use salt to get your sodium intake?
Sure, yeah. So sodium is Na, the chemical symbol, the element, and sodium chloride is NaCl, and that's table salt or standard salt that you would find in food products. And NaCl per unit volume is approximately 40% sodium and 60% chloride. So if you've got 1,000 milligrams of salt, you've only actually got 400 milligrams of sodium. And the sodium is the important bit. You'll see a lot of sports products, like some of our drinks, we use sodium citrate rather than sodium chloride, because it has a slightly less overtly salty taste for the very strong products that we make, but still delivers a good amount of sodium per unit. So when you're reading the packets of things, it's very important to split out the difference between whether you're reading the sodium value or the sodium chloride value. There's a huge difference in those.
Excellent. Yeah, now move down that list from salt and the other ways to get sodium in.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think the reason that we make we make a couple of ranges of drinks which are either in an effervescent tablet form or in a powder format that you mix into plain water, and they mix up different strengths of electrolyte. So we have a 250 milligram sodium, which is a very light drink, which is sort of half or less than the standard sports drink on the market, right up to we do a 500, 1,000 and a 1,500 milligram strength, which is about 3 times as strong as a standard drink. And for me, I don't race anywhere near as much or as seriously as I used to, but the 1,500 milligram product I've found it really useful when I'm doing long distance races now, and actually for pre-hydrating before big events, because it's just a very convenient way to get sodium in when you're on the move. You can have a premixed bottle, you know it's at the right concentration, it tastes good, you're inclined to drink it, and so that kind of works. So in that situation, those products work really well. And then we also make our own sweat salt capsule, it's called, which is like a little gel capsule with 250 milligrams of sodium in it from sodium citrate. And that's something which, if you're doing very long races, you maybe start with your own bottles, but you're not going to stop necessarily and mix bottles on the go. So you then pick up water from aid stations and chase, the relevant ratio of those capsules down with each bottle of water. And that's kind of a good way to do it on the move.
Yeah, and what about if you want to combine that fluid and sodium intake with your calorie intake? Can you just pour those your products, your precision hydration products with the sodium content into a regular sports drink to get those calories in at the same time, or would you recommend keeping them separate?
Yeah, we do have quite a few athletes that mix our products, especially the effervescent tablets or the capsules. They'll mix them into sports drinks which have a lot of calories in to increase the sodium content. So they kind of making an all-in-one solution in a bottle. So you've got fluid, electrolyte and calories all in a bottle. So that does work for some people, but I'm not a big fan of that approach. It never really worked for me particularly well. And we do come across a lot of athletes that struggle with that, because what you're doing when you put lots and lots of calories and salts and things into the same drink, you're effectively creating something which is quite thick and syrupy and has quite a high osmolality. So it's often very concentrated. And if it gets more concentrated than your blood, then you really struggle to absorb it at a fast rate through the gut into the bloodstream. That's not a problem in shorter events, but as longer events go on, you end up drinking more and more. Or if it's very hot and you're drinking a lot, you can really bung your stomach up and bung your guts up with thick syrupy drinks and feel quite nauseous and quite bloated. I definitely remember drinking a lot of Gatorade, kind of the full sugar standard Gatorade when I was doing a couple of big Ironman races, particularly in Hawaii when it was super hot. So I was drinking a lot more than normal, and I remember having really bad bloated stomach and feeling very uncomfortable on the bike for a long time because it wasn't clearing very well. And so we tend to advise, and I certainly tend to advise people to predominantly either drink water and take the sodium capsules, or drink a very light hypotonic electrolyte drink as the source of fluids, and get the calories from things like solid foods, bars, gels, jelly beans, whatever your preferred source of calories is. And what that does two things. It allows you to keep the fluids very light and thin and easy to absorb, which the stomach and the gut really like. It also allows you to dial up and down the calories versus the fluids and electrolytes on any given day based on your needs. And that's important because on a really cold day, you might have a relatively high requirement for calories, but a very low requirement for electrolytes and fluids. So if that's the case and you're getting all of it from a drink, you're going to have to drink a lot more than you feel like you need to just to get the calories in. On the flip side, if it's a really, really hot day, you might drink 3, 4, 5 times more than you do on a cold day, but that doesn't mean you need 3, 4 or 5 times more calories. So the amount that you eat can be tuned in as well. So yeah, I think that for me, the best approach is, calories are solid foods and gels, and bottles are for hydration and electrolytes.
Yeah, that all makes sense. But just to offer some context, on that interview with Jesse Kropelnicki that we had, he mentioned having athletes practice for a year or for 2 years to be able to absorb a lot of liquid. That said, as you say, you need to take the ambient temperature into account, and you can't just go out and drink the same amount in any given weather. But if you, let's say that Kona is what you're practicing for, then you don't necessarily, even though you right now can't absorb X amount of sports drink, then maybe a year from now you can. And that's not to say that either one of you is right or wrong, but just that there are great nuances of this, and people can take away a lot from both, and they're not opposing views either, but more, I would say, complementing. But that would be episode 40 for the listeners to go, because it's very much related to this episode as well. That makes a lot of sense, because I definitely, we do for sure come across athletes who
who can tolerate lots of liquid calories. And I've got people that we work with who pile our products into bottles which have a huge amount of calories and are very thick. And I know in myself I would really struggle with them, but they seem to thrive on them. And I actually think that the ability, having the gastric emptying and the fluid and calorie absorption in the gut is a big part of, if you like, your talent for endurance or not. And it is probably something that you can train.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to one more important question related to this topic. So we talked about how to get your sodium in, but what about when do you need it? Of course, during races and longer training sessions, but what about before races and training, and what about after?
Yeah, before races is a huge one, because that's where we see people's hydration strategies start to unravel right at the start. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that before big races, people get nervous about hydration, especially if the weather's going to be hot, and they have a tendency to start drinking a few days before, drinking lots of water or lots of sports drinks, and drinking way too much. In fact, they think that they need to be going to the toilet a lot, and the pee needs to be clear, because that means they're really well hydrated. But in actual fact, if you overdo it, what you end up with is a situation where you start to flush electrolytes out of your body. Your body kicks out a lot of urine because it's trying not to hold on to excess fluid, and you can almost end up mildly hyponatremic before you start. And I'm sure that's actually a bigger problem than people realize before events. So we definitely recommend that you can't hold on to much extra fluid, but in the last 48 hours, if you drink something, the drink we recommend is obviously our Precision Hydration 1500 strength, which has a high amount of electrolytes, high enough so that your body will pull some of the sodium in them into the bloodstream, pull a little bit of extra fluid in with it when you drink it, and hold it there, rather than peeing it out, because it's trying to keep that blood sodium level balanced. And we normally recommend something like 500 milliliters or 16 ounces of that the night or the evening before a big race, and another similar amount on the morning of a big race, finishing it about an hour before the start. And that, as long as your hydration practices around that are fairly decent and normal, you don't need to do a lot more than that in terms of getting some fluid on board to be very well topped up. But I still see a lot of athletes kind of overdoing the fluids beforehand, and actually it's probably counterproductive for them in many ways.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I've probably been guilty of that myself. For sure, you notice that when you need to go and pee 7 times in the last couple of hours or 3 hours before a race, then that's probably overdoing it a little bit, I would assume.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of recovery after events, I think, again, it's the same principle, really. There's a very strong correlation in all the studies that have been done. There's a very strong correlation between the amount of sodium that's in a drink and how well your body retains that fluid when you drink it. So after an event, you should definitely be guided a bit by your taste buds, because sometimes I finish an event, and if I'm very, very dehydrated, I feel actually very thirsty for plain water, because that's your body's way of telling you that the salt levels in the blood are rising because it's becoming more concentrated and you need to dilute it down. So it might be that at first you just want to drink plain water, but then in the hours afterwards, we usually recommend some of the stronger electrolyte drinks, just drunk to taste and just drink to how much you feel like you need, but they will rehydrate you a lot faster than relying on water alone.
Yeah, that's a great tip, and something that I think that most probably aren't aware of. So that's very helpful. One thing that I want to cover still is cramps. We mentioned how sodium can have a big impact on cramps, but it's a big question, and I think that sodium is probably not the only reason. What's your current take on cramps and why they occur?
Yeah, that's a huge and controversial sort of topic, isn't it? Because a lot of people have different opinions. But if I can put a plug in for it, we did a pretty big blog on that on our website, and we have a hydration advice tab on precisionhydration.com, and there's a big cramping blog on there, which I can't kind of regurgitate everything that's in it now, but that's an interesting thing to read. But in essence, I think there is so much rich anecdote and some scientific evidence as well to support the idea that extreme sodium loss or extreme sodium dilution in the body does or can influence and cause muscle cramps. And so many stories of athletes who, when they get their sodium balance right, like myself, I find that if I get it wrong, it leads to cramps. If I get it right, the cramps go away. So there's kind of describing the mechanism which causes that is potentially really difficult, but there's a very strong relationship between the two. So I would never in a million years suggest that electrolyte balance is the only cause of muscle cramps. I've had muscle cramps. I've jumped into cold water at the start of a race, where it's clearly not to do with electrolyte loss. It's just to do with your body tensing up very fast and kind of going into a bit of shock. And there's other muscle cramps that people get that are more related to fatigue and neuromuscular problems. But I definitely think that if you're someone who gets cramps, and if you get them particularly in the heat, particularly in long endurance events, and particularly late on when you're becoming depleted in terms of having high sweat outputs and not adequate replacement, then looking at your sodium and fluid balance is a very good place to start.
Yeah, perfect. I just found your article on your blog, and we're going to link up to this in the show notes. As you say, it looks very comprehensive and definitely something that I think will interest the listeners. Cool. So I think that's about it in terms of my questions for you regarding your precision hydration products and sodium cramps and all sorts of things. We have some rapid fire questions still. Do you have anything else that you want to add for these topics that we've been discussing today before we go into that?
I don't think there's anything specific, Mikkel. Just to say though that we, as a business, Precision Hydration, we don't think of ourselves as a product and a drink company. We're a kind of an athlete consultancy, really, and we enjoy getting questions via the website or via Facebook and Twitter and things like that from athletes. So if anyone wants to look us up via the website or via our Twitter account is @thesweatexperts, and anyone who's listening who thinks they've got questions that they want to ask us, I would encourage them to interact, because we'll always try and get back to them and answer them on a one-to-one basis.
Yeah, great, excellent. So the rapid fire questions that I have for you is, first, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon or endurance sports?
I think for overall a bit of everything, I really like slowtwitch.com. You get good, well-researched articles on there, up-to-date news, some controversial opinion, there's forums. So I'm kind of an avid slowtwitch.com reader. Yeah,
great. What's your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
When I was racing, it was a power meter on the bike. That was brilliant for me. Really enjoyed getting into the numbers on that.
And finally, what's the favorite race that you've done?
In recent years, it's been the swim run World Championships, the Ötulö in Sweden, the long distance swim run. That was brilliant.
Yeah, I hoped you were going to say that. I saw that you have been dabbling into that, and I've been doing one of those myself, and I'm actually going to participate in the Finnish National Championships this September.
Fantastic.
And it's a great sport, and you Brits have been taking it up pretty a lot in the last couple of years, I think. So it's great to see that it's spreading from its origins in Sweden, and then probably Finland, my country, has been the second largest country for swim runs, but I think that the UK will soon overtake all of us, because it's spreading like wildfire.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of people who are either used to do triathlon, who are still doing it, and it's just a great fun diversion, basically.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so you mentioned a few, but just to recap, where can the listeners connect with you and with Precision Hydration?
So our website's precisionhydration.com. The best email address if they want to contact us directly is just hello@precisionhydration.com. We're on social media, all the usual, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. It's usually @Precision Hydration, except for on Twitter where we're @thesweatexperts.
Perfect, and everything will be linked up in the show notes so that people can find it easily. All right, this has been Andy Blow. Thank you for coming on the show, Andy. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
And there you have it. As I said in the interview, I took that online sweat test myself, and I'll be using those results in the upcoming Olympic distance national championships, which are less than 2 weeks from now by the time that you hear this episode. Since the distance is shorter, Olympic distance, the primary tactic here is to use the pH 1500 during my preloading and hydration in the day before and days before the actual race, just as we talked about on the interview, to make sure I arrive hydrated and with all my sodium requirements covered, and not so much hydrating or focusing on that during the actual race. Maybe a little bit I'll add to a sports drink bottle, but the primary tactic is the preloading phase. And I'll report on how that goes, and that will be good. I will be using precision hydration products for that test. Boy, time really flies when you're having fun, and the next episode is episode 50. So it'll be a special episode with a compilation of great nuggets that we've heard in the first 49 episodes. So I haven't done that yet, but I'm excited for doing that and putting it together. Massive shout out to everybody who has been sending in ratings and reviews. That has really helped me grow the show a lot recently. And it's now been listened to in more than 90 countries, which is insane to think of for a niche subject like triathlon. And I'm super grateful for that. I want to read a recent one that came in from the United Kingdom. Team Roche writes, excellent 5 stars. Covers many aspects of triathlon, but without excessive hype. It is entertaining and informative and based as far as possible on research rather than subjective opinion. Good format, easy to listen to, and I always learn something. What's not to like? Well, thank you a lot, Team Roche, for that. And if you agree with this and would like to send in your own rating and review, then you can do so. If you don't know how to do it, then I have step-by-step instructions on scientifictriathlon.com/rate, and it will only take you a minute. The show notes for this episode will be on thattriathlonshow.com. As always, remember that you can send me emails with feedback, questions, tell me what I should be doing better to michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. I really, really look forward to talking to you again on Thursday in the special episode 50. Until then, keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.